You've probably heard the story. Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, was stolen by a smooth-talking Trojan prince named Paris. Her jealous Greek husband, Menelaus, called in his big brother Agamemnon, and together they launched 1,000 ships to get her back. After 10 years of siege, the Greeks finally tricked the Trojans with a giant wooden horse. Troy burns. The Greeks win. Roll credits. That's the version we all grew up with. Part Hollywood blockbuster, part high school literature class. But what if I told you that's not the full story? What if Helen wasn't really kidnapped? What if Paris wasn't a romantic hero, or even that important? What if the Trojan War wasn't even about love, but something much more familiar? Power, politics, and a land grab? Welcome to the real Trojan War. This isn't just mythology. Archaeologists believe there really was a war, or maybe a series of wars, around the 12th or 13th century BCE in what's now modern-day Turkey. And while the ancient poet Homer gave us the Iliad, the dramatic, poetic version full of gods and heroes, the truth underneath is far messier and way more interesting. This story has everything: betrayal, prophecy, ego, war crimes. And yes, a giant wooden horse, though not quite how you think. And that's exactly what we're unpacking in this video. Over the next 50 minutes, we'll break down who Helen actually was, and whether she even wanted to leave. The weird godly drama that started it all. Hint, it involves a golden apple. How Achilles and Patroclus nearly changed the war. Whether the Trojan horse was even real or just ancient propaganda. And why this ancient story still shapes our movies, politics, and love stories today. But first, let's clear something up. Most of what we think we know about the Trojan War comes from Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid, epic poems written hundreds of years after the events they describe. These weren't documentaries. They were ancient fan fiction. Legendary? Absolutely. But reliable history? Not exactly. That said, modern archaeologists, like Heinrich Schliemann in the 1800s and others since, have actually found ruins of a city in northwest Turkey that fits the description of Troy. It was a walled city. It was burned. And it sits right where Homer said it would. So maybe there really was a war. But it probably didn't start because two people fell in love, or because of a goddess beauty contest. That's just the poetic version. The real reasons? Strategic trade routes, Aegean control, Eastern wealth. Basically, business, not romance. Because if you've ever wondered why the Greeks would spend 10 years and countless lives fighting over one woman, you're not alone. So buckle up. We're diving into the real story, not just the pretty one. And trust me, it wasn't just about Helen. Let's talk about Helen. You've heard the tagline, the face that launched 1,000 ships. Beautiful, tragic, passive, the ultimate damsel in distress. But what if Helen wasn't just a prize to be won or a trophy to be stolen? What if she was a power player caught in the middle of a political chessboard? Let's start with the basics. Helen was the daughter of Zeus, yes, that Zeus, and Leda, a Spartan queen. According to myth, Zeus seduced or assaulted Leda in the form of a swan. Classic Zeus behavior. Helen hatched from an egg because of course she did. She was destined to be breathtakingly beautiful, and apparently everyone knew it. So when she came of age, every king, prince, and warlord in the region showed up to marry her. Think The Bachelorette, Bronze Age edition. To avoid bloodshed, her stepfather Tyndareus made all the suitors swear an oath. Whoever Helen chose, the rest would protect that marriage at all costs. Helen chose Menelaus, younger brother of the powerful King Agamemnon. He became king of Sparta by marriage. Helen settled into royal life. She had a daughter. Things seemed relatively stable. Then along came Paris. Now, whether Helen fell in love and went willingly or was kidnapped depends on who you ask. In Homer's Iliad, Helen expresses regret and self-loathing. But she's not exactly chained to a bed. In other versions, she's clearly a hostage, and in some tellings, get this, she never went to Troy at all. A phantom copy of her was taken instead, while the real Helen waited it out in Egypt. But let's focus on the version where she did go. Why would a queen leave her child, her crown, and her country to run off with a foreign prince? Was Paris that irresistible? Or was something else going on? Here's where the love story starts to look like politics. Paris wasn't just some handsome drifter. He was a Trojan prince. And Troy, at the time, was a growing power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Its location, controlling trade between Asia and Europe, made it strategically and economically vital. If Helen went willingly, maybe she saw something in Troy. Maybe she wasn't happy in Sparta. Maybe she was a political piece in a larger game. And if she was taken by force, well, that's still politics. Because Helen wasn't just a person, she was a symbol. Taking her meant insulting Sparta, and by extension the entire Greek world. The oath taken by her former suitors? That wasn't just a romantic gesture, that was a military pact. The moment Helen left, war became inevitable. But here's the twist. Menelaus and Agamemnon might have wanted that war. Not just to get Helen back, but to control Troy's trade routes, to dominate the eastern seas, to project power beyond Greece. Helen may have been the excuse, not the reason. And think about her role during the war. In the Iliad, she's in Troy, working on her weaving, watching the battles from the walls. She seems more like a detached observer than a desperate prisoner. She talks with Priam, the Trojan king. She insults Paris for his cowardice. She even recognizes the Greek warriors by name. She's not some passive damsel. She's sharp, witty, trapped, maybe, but never silent. And in the end, when Troy falls, Helen simply walks back to Menelaus. He kills anyone who stands in the way, but not her. He takes her home. No punishment, no shame. She becomes queen of Sparta again. The war's over. Life moves on. It's weird. Unless you see Helen not as a love interest, but as a diplomat, a figure of power and persuasion. Maybe even someone who understood that survival, not loyalty, was the real currency of the ancient world. Helen has been many things over the centuries. Victim, villain, goddess, ghost. But maybe the real Helen was just a human, trying to navigate impossible choices in a world run by prideful men and petulant gods. So yes, she was beautiful. But that's not why the war happened. She was valuable, symbolic, political, a reason to rally armies and seize power. And in that sense, she wasn't just the face that launched 1,000 ships. She was the spark that lit a fire already waiting to burn. To really understand how the Trojan War began, you have to go way back. Not to Sparta, not to Troy, but to a wedding, a divine wedding, and the worst party crasher in mythological history. It starts with the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, two immortals. Peleus was a mortal hero. Thetis was a sea nymph who didn't even want to marry him, but Zeus insisted. All the gods were invited. Well, almost all. One goddess was deliberately left off the guest list, Eris, the goddess of discord. Now, you might think, what's the big deal? But remember, this is Greek mythology. Leaving a goddess off your wedding invite list is basically a death wish. So Eris showed up anyway, and she didn't bring a toaster or wine. She brought a golden apple. On the side of that apple, she carved 3 little words. To the fairest. Then she tossed it into the crowd, and chaos exploded. 3 goddesses lunged for it. Hera, queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. All 3 claimed it was meant for them. A classic beauty pageant, only with cosmic consequences. Zeus, not wanting to get in the middle of a divine catfight, outsourced the judging. He picked a mortal to decide, Paris, the young prince of Troy. Now, Paris wasn't exactly qualified for this job. He'd been raised in the countryside, away from politics, after a prophecy warned that he would bring ruin to Troy. But gods don't care about qualifications. So the three goddesses appeared before him and started bribing him. Hera offered him power to be king of all Europe and Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and success in battle. Aphrodite offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Guess which one he picked? Yep, Aphrodite. Paris gave her the golden apple, and in return, she promised him Helen. There's just one problem. Helen was already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. But minor details, right? This is where mythology starts to blur with reality. The judgment of Paris is myth, of course, but it tells us something important. The ancient Greeks didn't see this war as purely political. They saw it as the result of pride, vanity, and bad decisions on a divine scale. This wasn't just humans messing things up. The gods were involved. The war was fate, cursed from the beginning. And Paris? He was just a pawn. Or maybe a fool with a good jawline. Because when he traveled to Sparta, welcomed by Menelaus as a guest, he betrayed every custom of hospitality, either by seducing Helen or abducting her, or something in between. He left Greece with a queen on his ship. Some say Aphrodite used magic. Others say Helen was bored and restless. Either way, she was gone. And with her, peace. The rest, as they say, is war. But remember, all of this, the ships, the battles, the legends, started because someone didn't get invited to a wedding, because a goddess wanted revenge, because a prince wanted a girl, because three immortals fought over a fruit. Is it absurd? Yes, but also deeply human, because under all the glitter and myth, this is a story about insecurity, ego, and choices, the kind that change everything. A golden apple fell, and history cracked wide open. So who exactly was Paris? In the movies, he's the pretty boy, soft, romantic, maybe a little pathetic. The guy who ran off with another man's wife and doomed a city. But in mythology, Paris is way more complicated and a whole lot more interesting. Let's start with the prophecy. When Paris was born, his parents, King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy, were warned that their son would bring the city's destruction. Not metaphorically, literally. Fire, blood, doom. So naturally, they did what any loving royal parents would do. They tried to kill him. Paris was abandoned on a mountainside, but instead of dying, he was rescued and raised by shepherds. He grew up strong, handsome, and completely unaware of his royal blood. And by the time he was a young man, he'd gained a reputation, not just for looks, but for fairness. That's why Zeus picked him to judge the Golden Apple contest. Irony, right? The kid who was supposed to destroy Troy is the one who unknowingly sets the war in motion by picking Aphrodite and claiming Helen. But was Paris really just a reckless romantic, or was he being played? Some myths suggest Paris was manipulated by the gods, especially Aphrodite, from the start. Others say he knew exactly what he was doing, that taking Helen wasn't just about love, it was a power move, an insult, a dare. Remember, Troy was rising in influence. Paris's action may have been a statement, "We don't fear the Greeks, we can take your queen and get away with it." If so, it backfired. Big time. Now, when Paris returns to Troy with Helen, his brothers, especially Hector, aren't thrilled. Hector is a real warrior, a commander, someone who knows what this will mean. War, death, a siege that could last for years. Paris, on the other hand, doesn't seem to care. He's a lover, not a fighter. He spends more time in bed than on the battlefield. And when he does fight, like in his one-on-one duel with Menelaus, he gets absolutely wrecked. The only reason he survives is because Aphrodite steps in and yanks him off the battlefield, which frankly doesn't earn him a lot of respect from the other Trojans. To them, Paris is a problem, a spark that lit a fire, and now they have to deal with the consequences. But there's another angle to Paris, and it's one we don't talk about enough. What if Paris wasn't a coward, but a realist. He knew he wasn't a warrior like Hector. He knew the war wasn't going to be won in single combat. Maybe he played to his strengths, charm, persuasion, divine backing, because he had no choice. And when you look at him through that lens, Paris becomes something else entirely, a scapegoat, a symbol of everything that went wrong, a man born into a curse, used by gods, blamed by mortals. He didn't start the war alone. He didn't cause the prophecy, but he carried it all the way to the city gates. Even his death is telling. Paris eventually kills Achilles, the greatest Greek warrior, with an arrow guided by the god Apollo. But it doesn't make him a hero. It makes him a shadow, a name in a long list of tragedies. He's wounded soon after and dies trying to find help from a former lover who refuses to save him. No glory, no redemption. So what was Paris? A prince, yes, a playboy, definitely, but also a pawn, a piece moved by gods and kings in a game far bigger than himself. And in the end, maybe he was exactly what the myths warned. Not evil, not heroic, just dangerous in his indecision. Because sometimes the person who burns the world isn't the villain or the conqueror. It's the one who thinks love will protect him from consequence. And Paris? He was wrong. Let's flip the script. In most retellings, the Greeks are the heroes, the noble warriors, the justice bringers, avenging a stolen wife and restoring honor to their king. But what if they weren't? What if the Greeks weren't heroes, but invaders? First, let's talk numbers. The Greeks didn't just send a few ships. They sent over 1,000, filled with warriors from every corner of the Greek world. Mycenae, Sparta, Ithaca, Argos, Crete. They formed a coalition army led by Agamemnon, the most powerful king in the region. That's not a rescue mission. That's an invasion. Agamemnon wasn't fighting just for his brother Menelaus. He was fighting for control, of trade, of power, of prestige. Troy was strategically located near the Dardanelles, the gateway between the Aegean and Black Sea. Whoever controlled Troy controlled trade between East and West. So yes, Helen was the excuse, but she wasn't the reason. The Greeks arrived on Trojan shores and set up camp for a 10-year siege. 10 years. That's not an emotional response. That's a long-term military operation. And during those years, they weren't exactly saints. Greek warriors raided neighboring towns. They slaughtered civilians, took women as prizes, burned crops and temples. This wasn't just a conflict between kings. It was a brutal, grinding campaign that devastated the region. Achilles, their greatest warrior, captured and killed by the dozen. He famously took the Trojan woman Briseis as a war prize, sparking the feud with Agamemnon that nearly broke their alliance. These weren't acts of honor, they were acts of power. Odysseus, the clever tactician, was brilliant, but ruthless. He lied, manipulated, and eventually helped craft the ultimate trick, the Trojan horse. Ajax the Lesser? He desecrated temples, assaulted priestesses. Not exactly the behavior of noble heroes. Even Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief, sacrificed his own daughter, Iphigenia, to gain favorable winds to sail to Troy. According to the myths, he tricked her into thinking she was getting married, then killed her at the altar. That's the level of dedication they had to this war, or maybe the level of ambition. Now let's look at the Trojans. Troy was a walled city, sophisticated, wealthy, culturally rich. They defended their homeland for a decade. Hector, their greatest warrior, fought not for conquest, but for survival, for his city, for his wife and son. The Trojans weren't perfect. They made mistakes. Paris being the biggest one. But they weren't aggressors. And yet, history, or at least the versions passed down by Greek poets, painted them as doomed, arrogant, or weak. Why? Because the victors write the myths, and the Greeks made sure their version echoed through time. But now, with archaeology and hindsight, we can reframe the story. Troy wasn't just a backdrop, it was a target. And the Greeks weren't just warriors. They were invaders, opportunists, men with spears and strategies and very human flaws. And maybe, just maybe, the real tragedy of the Trojan War wasn't that a woman was taken. It's that thousands died so that a handful of kings could say they didn't back down. This wasn't a romantic war, it was empire building, Bronze Age style. So what actually happened during the siege of Troy? We know the myth: 10 years of war, heroes clashing, gods interfering, endless duels and drama. But how much of that is real? And how much is poetic exaggeration? Let's break it down. First, historians and archaeologists do believe there was a real Troy, likely located at the site now called Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey. And they've found layers of destruction in the ruins, especially one around the 12th century BCE, which shows signs of fire and warfare. That fits the time frame of the Trojan War, but it doesn't prove Homer's Iliad is literal history. It just proves something big went down. What probably happened wasn't a single 10-year siege, but a series of conflicts. Troy, sitting on a key trade route, was likely attacked multiple times over the centuries. The Greeks may have fought the Trojans more than once, and over more than just Helen. Now, about that 10-year timeline. It's symbolic. The number 10 often shows up in myth as a sign of completeness. What matters more is what the war represented. A long, bitter campaign, exhausting for both sides. According to the Iliad, the Greeks camped outside the city for years. They built fortifications, raided nearby towns, argued among themselves constantly. The Trojans, meanwhile, stayed behind their massive walls, safe but slowly wearing down. One of the strangest things about the siege? The Trojans barely fought outside the city. Most of the war, as described by Homer, is duels and skirmishes. That might reflect Bronze Age warfare, which didn't always involve full-scale battles. It was more about shows of strength, heroism, and gaining divine favor. And speaking of divine favor, the gods were very busy during this siege. In the myth, gods constantly interfered. Zeus wavered, Hera schemed, Athena fought alongside the Greeks, Apollo backed the Trojans, Aphrodite protected Paris. It was a divine soap opera with mortals as chess pieces. But from a historical lens, this divine drama might be a way to explain the randomness and chaos of war. Why did one side win a battle one day, only to lose the next? Why did brave men die while cowards survived? Ancient Greeks didn't have statistics. They had gods. Now let's talk about some key events that probably didn't happen as written, but tell us a lot about the mythic mindset. Achilles refusing to fight. The greatest Greek warrior sits in his tent because Agamemnon stole his war prize. It sounds petty, but it reflects real tension in coalition armies. Ancient generals weren't always unified. Pride and politics got in the way. A lot. Patroclus wearing Achilles' armor. Again, maybe not literally true, but symbolically it shows how desperate the Greeks became. They needed their best warrior, and when he was gone, morale collapsed. Hector's death. A tragic, poetic moment. Hector, the heart of Troy, faces Achilles. He dies bravely knowing his city is doomed. Historically accurate? Who knows? Emotionally powerful? Absolutely. The gods taking sides. Not real in a literal sense, but emotionally resonant. Every army believed the gods were with them, and every loss needed a divine explanation. But here's something we rarely talk about. Siege warfare back then was brutal. Supplies ran low, disease spread, morale crumbled, people starved, and for the defenders, being behind walls didn't always mean safety. It just meant slow suffering. For the Greeks, camping for years away from home, with no clear end in sight, meant constant tension, boredom, infighting, leadership challenges. And every failed assault was a reminder. This city wouldn't fall easily. And that raises the big question. If the Greeks were so strong and Troy so isolated, why did it take 10 years? Because those walls were real. The ruins at Hisarlik show that Troy was heavily fortified, with massive stone defenses. It wasn't a soft target, it was built to last. And without siege engines or artillery, the Greeks couldn't just storm the gates, they had to wait, to trick, to bleed the city dry. In the end, the siege of Troy wasn't just a military campaign, it was psychological warfare, attrition, endurance. And when it finally ended, it wasn't in glorious battle. It ended with a lie, but we'll get to that in the next chapter. If there's one name you remember from the Trojan War, it's Achilles, the near-invincible warrior, son of a goddess, killer of Hector, and, depending on who's telling the story, either the hero of the war or its biggest tragedy. But to understand Achilles, we have to talk about someone else first. Patroclus. Now, in the Iliad, Patroclus is Achilles' closest companion. Maybe a friend, maybe more. Their relationship is deeply emotional, fiercely loyal, and, in many interpretations, romantic. The ancient Greeks didn't label sexuality the way we do. What mattered was connection, bond, love, and Achilles loved Patroclus. At the start of the war, Achilles is already a legend, but when Agamemnon insults him by taking his war prize, the woman Briseis, Achilles refuses to fight. He pulls out of the war and sulks in his tent. The Greeks start losing, badly. And Patroclus, seeing his friends dying, begs Achilles to let him wear his armor, just to rally the troops, to give them hope. Achilles agrees, reluctantly. Patroclus puts on the armor, charges into battle, and everything changes. He fights brilliantly. He pushes the Trojans back. But then he gets reckless. He tries to take the city, and Hector, the Trojan champion, kills him. The moment Achilles hears this, everything shifts. He doesn't mourn quietly. He explodes, with grief, with rage, with unstoppable fury. He returns to the battlefield, and what follows is some of the bloodiest fighting in the Iliad. Achilles doesn't just kill Hector, he desecrates his body, drags it behind his chariot, refuses to return it for burial. He becomes a force of nature. This is the turning point of the war. Not Helen, not Paris, not even the Trojan horse. Patroclus' death is what pulls Achilles back. It reignites the Greek army. It breaks the Trojan spirit. It sets the final act in motion. Now, some scholars believe Patroclus wasn't even part of the earliest stories, that he was added later to give Achilles depth, emotion, humanity. But whether historical or poetic, their bond is the emotional heart of the Trojan War. Achilles wasn't just a warrior. He was a man in love, a man in pain, a man who lost the one person who kept his anger in check. And what makes Achilles so powerful isn't just that he's unbeatable. It's that he knows he's going to die. Before he ever joined the war, his mother Thetis gave him a choice. Live a long, quiet life in obscurity, or die young and be remembered forever. Achilles chose glory, and Patroclus' death made that choice real. He knew he wouldn't survive the war, but he no longer cared. Because grief does that. It changes your math. And that's what makes Achilles one of the most compelling characters in all of myth. He's not just a soldier. He's not just angry. He's broken. And yet he fights anyway. Eventually he kills Hector, returns the body to King Priam in one of the most moving scenes in ancient literature. Then he dies himself, struck down by Paris, with help from Apollo, the gods tying up their own loose ends. But even in death, Achilles wins. He becomes a legend, a name that echoes forever. And it all started with Patroclus, because this war wasn't just about Helen, it was about love, loss, and the choices that make you immortal, even when they kill you. Okay. Let's talk about the most famous trick in ancient history, the Trojan horse. You know the image. A giant wooden horse wheeled up to Troy's gates. The Greeks pretend to sail away. The Trojans bring the horse inside as a gift. But at night, Greek soldiers hidden inside sneak out, open the gates, and boom, city falls. Troy is destroyed from within. It's brilliant. It's cinematic. It's burned into pop culture forever. But did it really happen? Let's start with the basics. The story of the Trojan horse doesn't appear in Homer's Iliad at all. The Iliad ends before Troy falls. The horse comes later, mostly in Virgil's Aeneid, written hundreds of years later by a Roman poet. It's a postscript, not part of the original myth. So already we're in legendary territory. Could it have happened anyway? Maybe, but probably not with a literal wooden horse. Let's look at what might be true. Some historians believe the horse was a metaphor. In ancient Greek slang, horse could mean siege engine, like a battering ram or a wheeled tower. So it's possible the Greeks used a machine to breach the walls, and the story got mythologized over time. Another theory? Earthquake. The city of Troy sat in an earthquake-prone region. Some ruins show signs of structural collapse. Maybe the horse was a symbol, a sacred offering to Poseidon, god of earthquakes and horses. Maybe the Greeks prayed for destruction, and got it. A third idea? Spycraft. What if a small group of Greeks really did sneak into the city, not inside a giant horse, but via trickery, a hidden entrance, a bribed guard, a faked retreat? That kind of infiltration could be remembered over generations as a dramatic deception, eventually becoming the wooden horse. But let's entertain the original version for a second. Would a city really drag a massive enemy structure inside their walls? It seems ridiculous, but think about it. The Trojans were desperate, tired, surrounded for a decade. Suddenly the enemy flees, leaving behind a symbol of surrender, a gift to the gods. They were looking for a reason to believe the war was over. That's what made the trick so effective. Because the Trojan horse isn't just a physical object, it's a symbol of overconfidence, of false peace, of believing what you want to believe, even when it defies logic. And in that way, it's timeless. We've all seen Trojan horses in modern life, scams, Trojan viruses, sweet-looking offers with danger inside. The phrase, "beware Greeks bearing gifts," still relevant. And that's why the story endures, even if the horse didn't exist. Because at its core, it's not about wood and wheels. It's about trust. And how easy it is to lose everything when you let the wrong thing in. So was the Trojan horse real? Not exactly. But the warning it carries? Very real. The Trojan horse worked. That night, while the Trojans slept, celebrating what they thought was peace, the Greeks emerged from the horse. They opened the city gates. The rest of the Greek army, waiting quietly offshore, returned under cover of darkness and stormed the city. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. The fall of Troy was brutal, bloody, and without mercy. Temples were looted. Homes were burned. Priests were slaughtered. Women were taken as slaves. Children were killed to prevent revenge. It wasn't a victory. It was an erasure. Even the gods, according to myth, were horrified. Athena, enraged by the sacrilege committed by her own Greek followers, cursed them. Many Greek leaders who had won the war never made it home. Agamemnon was murdered by his wife. Ajax was shipwrecked. Odysseus, as we'll see, wandered for 10 years. Their triumph at Troy was followed by punishment, exile, and tragedy. Why? Because in Greek storytelling, hubris, excessive pride, always leads to downfall. The Greeks had won, but they'd overstepped. They'd forgotten humility. And the gods made them pay. But what about the Trojans? Troy was reduced to rubble. King Priam was killed. Queen Hecuba was enslaved. Hector's wife and child were thrown from the walls. It was the end of a civilization, and yet, not quite. Because from the ashes of Troy, a new story begins. According to myth, one Trojan escaped, Aeneas. A prince, a warrior, a survivor, led by the gods, carrying his father on his back and holding his son's hand, Aeneas fled the burning city. He wandered through the Mediterranean, eventually landing in Italy. There, his descendants, or so the Romans claimed, would found the city of Rome. This myth, told in Virgil's Aeneid, connected Roman identity directly to Troy. In Roman eyes, they weren't just a new power, they were heirs of a fallen empire. Is it true? Historically? Number. But it shows the lasting power of the Trojan story. It wasn't just a Greek myth, it became a European origin tale, a legend about rebirth, legacy, and endurance. And it raises a haunting question. What if the losers wrote the next chapter? The Greeks destroyed Troy, but the Trojans, through storytelling, through myth, through Rome, got the final word. And maybe that's why this story still matters. Because Troy didn't just fall. It evolved. And in the end, it rose again. Not in stone, but in memory. Why does the Trojan War still matter? Why, thousands of years later, do we still tell this story? In poems, in plays, in books, in movies, in memes. Because the Trojan War isn't just about ancient heroes. It's about us. It's about what happens when pride collides with love, when politics dresses up as romance, when grief turns a man into a legend, and revenge burns a city to the ground. The Trojan War is timeless because the emotions in it never changed. Helen represents beauty, yes, but also how women are used as excuses for male ambition. She was blamed for a war she didn't start, fought over like a crown, dragged across borders by gods and kings. Sound familiar? Paris is the man who thinks charm will protect him from consequence. Achilles is the warrior torn between glory and love. Patroclus is the friend, or maybe more, whose death turns the tide of war. Hector is the noble defender, fighting for a future he knows he won't live to see. And the Greeks? They are us. When we mistake conquest for justice, when we take what we want and call it honor. And Troy? Troy is every place that's ever fallen because someone powerful wanted more. We retell this story not because it's ancient, but because it's eternal. You see it in Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, in Hollywood's Troy, in books like The Song of Achilles or Circe, in shows like Game of Thrones, where every character is a shadow of someone who once stood on the fields outside Troy. We hear it every time someone says Trojan horse. We quote it when we say Achilles' heel. We invoke it when we talk about battles, betrayals, and the cost of glory. And still, new generations find something fresh in it. Some find tragedy. Some find romance. Some find strategy. Some find a mirror. Because the Trojan War was never really just about Helen. It was about people, their fears, their flaws, their pride, their pain. And that's what makes it last. So the next time you hear that someone launched 1,000 ships, remember, they weren't just chasing beauty. They were chasing something deeper and darker and more human than they ever wanted to admit. That's the real story of the Trojan War, and it's still not over.